Are you getting anything? Can you hear it? Can you hear it now? You have to put headphones on. Landmark Lecture Series. I'm Mark Hudson, Executive Director of Tudor Place, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you who've joined us here in person at the Dower House, as well as those of you who are joining us virtually. We begin our program this evening with Tudor Place's Indigenous Land Acknowledgement Statement. We respectfully acknowledge the Nacotchtank, Anacostan, and Piscataway people on whose ancestral homeland Tudor Place Historic House and Garden sits. We also celebrate the vibrant Native communities who make their homes in the DC area today. This evening's program, as well as other programs of our 2023 lecture series, is supported by an Institute of Museum and Library Services Inspire grant for small museums. The findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the IMLS. And the theme for our 2023 lecture series is Centering Stories of Enslavement at Tudor Place. The 6 programs in the series will explore groundbreaking techniques used to center the stories of communities traditionally marginalized in historical narratives, and reveals how these practices have led to a more inclusive interpretation here at Tudor Place. So it is therefore very appropriate that we begin the series with tonight's program that will explore the intersection of museums and social justice and the important work our speaker is doing to bring diversity and inclusion to museums. Omar Eaton-Martinez is host of the Museum J.E.D.I podcast that convenes discussions on the intersection of museums and social justice. And that's how I first became acquainted with him, but I learned as I read his bio, he's doing a whole bunch of other things as well. He's currently the Senior Vice President for Historic Sites at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, where he leads the preservation, interpretation, and stewardship of 28 historic sites across the country to tell the full American story. He's had leading roles in racial equity organizations like Museums and Race, Transformation and Justice, Museum Hue, as well as a part in the Museum as a Site for Social Action project. Omar was an American Alliance of Museums Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, Inclusion Senior Fellow and is currently President of the Board of Directors of the Association of African American Museums. Additionally, he is a gubernatorial appointee to the Maryland Lynching, Truth, and Reconciliation Commission, which is the first commission of its kind in the country. So we're honored to have him here this evening to launch our 2023 lecture series. So would you please join me in welcoming Omar Eaton-Martinez. Thank you.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Mark. Thank you for the invitation, Rob. Thank you for helping me facilitate this great presentation that we're all going to enjoy together, because that's why I like to do things collaboratively. Big shout out to Stacy Queen for her role in this as well. I have been traveling a lot the last 8 months in my new position. As you know, we have 28 sites across the country. I've been to 18 of them in 8 months, so I'm a little poop right now. But seeing your smiling faces gives me energy, and I'm excited to be here with all of you. So Mark introduced the project. So the Museum J.E.D.I is all mine, right? This is my institution. I've worked with institutions or for institutions all my life, including till now with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. But for me, at this point in my career, I thought about, well, I need to start thinking about institution building. I have a lot of people that I look up to in this field that are institution builders. And I thought, well, maybe I'll start small by creating my own institution in the form of a podcast, YouTube show, whatever which way you want to kind of describe what the show is. But the show started last year. And it's right now there's 4 episodes available on the museumj.com. We have about 2 or 3 shows in queue that we're going to record hopefully in the next couple of months and start adding to it. And it meets at the intersections of museums and social justice. I purposely did not name the show Museum J.E.D.I, right? There's a reason, there was an intentionality behind that. And for me, the reason is justice is the framework that we all aspire to. And we'll get into a little bit more about what that means later on in the presentation. But I think diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion are all worthy things to do and to activate. But for me, it has to be justice focused. And well, again, we'll get into that in a little bit as we go on into the presentation. So let me attempt to work this thing. Beautiful. So who am I? You know, you heard what Mark said, you heard a little bit of what I just said, but my positionality is very important in the work that I do. And what I mean by that is, how do I identify? How do people read me? And what do I tell people when they ask me who I am? And so for those, just to give you a little background, I think it's helpful as we dig into this work and we dig into this topic that you know a little bit about my personal background. So I was born in DC. I was raised in Silver Spring, Maryland. My parents came to this space from a beautiful island in the Caribbean called Puerto Rico. And they raised my sister and I here. My father was recruited to work at NASA, Goddard Space Flight Center, as a 20-year-old man who entered college at 15, went to school, University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez, which is like the tech campus of the University of Puerto Rico system, and I had a 40-year career here at Goddard Space Flight Center. My mother had taught 7 years in San Dulce, in San Juan, and did 34 years here in DC public schools at a great institution called Oyster Bilingual, which is one of probably the longest bilingual public education schools in this region of the country. And then we moved out to Silver Spring, and that's where I was raised. And so what I tell people that I want you to understand that within the 4 walls of my home, it was Puerto Rico. The smells, the language, the music was all Puerto Rico. When I left the threshold, it was very different. And as you can imagine, as someone who is African descendant, and then tell people that I'm Puerto Rican, and the way that I look is a little bit disruptive to most people in this country, even in today. And so that helped shape me a lot, because when people talk about inclusion and people talk about people on the margins, what I'm trying to help people understand is that I lived my whole life on the margins, even with those who also claim to be on the margins, right? So I can be in the African-American community space and not feel all the way included. I could be in a Latino, Latina, Latinx community space and not feel all the way included. And so that really shaped my thinking about inclusion, about justice, and really about the nuance of identity. I'm also someone who has been married for, it'll be 25 years this September. We have 4 children. One's in college already at University of Maryland, Baltimore County. All those things shape me. So I'm sharing with you who I am personally, because it has everything to do with what I do in my justice work, right? I know a lot of times we are sort of socialized to believe that our personal self has to be left at the threshold of the office that we step in. I rebuke that. I believe that my whole entire self is valuable to the space that I work in, and I celebrate it as much as I can. Now, just because I have these different backgrounds that are sort of on the margins doesn't mean that I don't operate from certain spaces of privilege. I'm college educated. I'm cisgendered male, I'm a Christian. All those things also impact my lens and also impact the way that my blind spots have been created. The difference, I would say, between myself and maybe the average person who doesn't even know what a blind spot is or what has not even delved into something like that is that I am actively working on addressing my blind spots as I become aware of them, right? And that's what we have to do as a society because we all have them and we're all continue to have them. The difference between the society that I aspire to and the society that I live in is that this society now doesn't have the tools or the mechanisms to even address that as a collective. Individually, we have people who can do it, but as a collective, it's not part of who we are. And so we have to start doing that type of work, and that work will definitely intersect with the museum work as museums are these colonial projects that have been flipped on its head by a lot of different museums, including this one, who are really trying to think about lifting up the voices of the unheard, unseen, and in this case, the enslaved. This picture, just to let you know, for those who are art folks, is done by my favorite artist named Samuel Lind. He's an Afro-Puerto Rican artist in a beautiful space in Puerto Rico called Loíza. And this is a depiction of Plena y Bomba. Plena y Bomba is a song, a genre of music and a dance that really was brought through Yoruba traditions from the enslaved Africans that were brought to the island. And so that's what you see here on your screen. So some of the work that I've been able to do was mentioned earlier. So I'll briefly kind of give you a little bit of context of how I got into these different organizations, and I think these are organizations worthy of you all looking them up and seeing what they're up to. And if you like what they're up to, maybe your support would be great. But the Museum Hue was started by Monica Montgomery and Stephanie Johnson Cunningham, two African American women based out of New York, who really saw a gap in the museum field where there was not a lot of professional development and collaboration and coalition building among some of the museums professionals that they would meet in New York. And they started to gel and they started to build programming around these issues. And now they've done work not only in the United States, but in different parts of the country. And I had the honor of serving as their first national board chair. Then you have Museums and Race, which is an effort that was started actually by an organization called the Museum Group. The Museum Group is an organization that was created, I'm not exactly sure, I would say about 20, 30 years ago by a bunch of museum professionals who decided to become independent consultants. And there was sort of like a movement at that time in the museum sector where a lot of people have been working in museums for a couple of decades and were building up these skill sets and these special knowledge and decided to go out on their own. But then once they went out on their own, they started missing the coalition building that they had with being a staff member. And so they started reaching out to one another and they built the Museum Group, which is a group that it's a sort of a membership fee, you pay into it and you gel together and you build. Now, the Museum Group had a great relationship with the American Alliance of Museums, which is our largest museum professional association. And over the course of the years, they would allow the Museum Group to have sort of these unconference spaces to talk about all the different topics that were pertinent in real time that weren't covered in the program agenda for the conference. And so in 2015, the conference was in Atlanta, Georgia. And it was just around the time where they, I believe, released the verdict of the police officers that murdered Fred Gray. And people were visibly upset and people were visibly not knowing what to do with themselves. And so a lot of people kind of came together in the unconference space and started talking about this. And so then the Museum Group tapped on the shoulder of two young museum professionals of color. And the Museum Group was largely older white women who are members of that group, and decided to work with them to create a convening in January of 2016. And so I was one of the people that were invited to that convening, and that convening resulted into this group that then eventually created some what we call the Transformation Lounge at AAM and a bunch of different other conference sessions that we did across adjacent associations. And we created something called the Museum Race Report Card. And then since the pandemic, they've now created their own conference, their own virtual conference. And so it's growing. And I was on the steering committee there for, I think it was from 2017 to about 2020, helping them grow the relationship with AAM and helping them grow out the different issues that they were looking at. So it was looking at institutional genealogies, it was looking at intersectionalities, it was looking at privilege, and it looked at different systems of oppression and the intersectionality of those systems of oppression within museum spaces. And so these two organizations certainly helped me grow as a museum professional to really lean in strategically around how we deal with justice and inclusion in museum spaces. Then it was Mass Action, which was underwritten by the Minneapolis Institute of Art. It was a 3-year project where we put together a toolkit. So if you Google Mass Action, you'll see, I think it's museumaction.org is their new website title. And you'll see the different things that we've been up to and the different things that have been created, including the toolkit, which I believe is like an 8-chapter toolkit that deals with all things inclusion related in museum spaces. And then I was appointed to work on the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is set up to be a temporary commission, but because of COVID, we ended up petitioning for more years. And now we're set to, I believe, finish at the end of 2024, where we're going around to the 14 counties in the state of Maryland that have documented racial terror lynchings from 1867 to 1933. And so we have held public hearings in at least 3 out of those 14 counties so far, where we bring together the descendants of the murdered and the descendants of the murderers and some of the other descendants of the communities who were impacted by that racial terror act. And so we're going to continue to do those for all 14. And we're looking to hopefully make some recommendations to the state that will make the work that we're doing now last beyond the end of the commission. Things like maybe a racial justice or a racial reconciliation center that allows people to continue to delve into these important topics. So I want to kind of delve into some of the sort of the tenets that I consider when I'm doing this work, when I do it for the agencies that I work for, when I do it as a consultant, or when I'm doing it with an association that I'm affiliated with. This is something that we have to own as people who care. You have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. If you think about how you work on your bodies, and your bodies get sore. I was just telling Rob earlier, I was working out yesterday. My legs are really sore right now. Well, they're sore because I worked them out, the muscles tear, and the muscles go back together stronger. That's what this work is. And I'm not comfortable right now. I'm standing here in front of you. I'm sore right now. It's hurting. But, but I know that I'm going to gain something from it at the end as I continue to work my body and get it stronger and more fit. This is the same thing with justice work. You have to be able to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. When people, hopefully call you in and not call you out about your blind spots, not to get, not to allow the fragility to kind of come up and be disruptive in that space. When you're thinking about how to do things differently and people are offering very radical ways and strategies and protocols, not to get upset about that, but to lean in and try to find out if that's something you can actually do, right? I mean, there's some things that are incredible. I will tell you one good example of being comfortable with being uncomfortable is what was happening at James Madison's Montpelier. It's one of our co-stewardship sites at the National Trust. A lot of this was occurring before I started my tenure there last July. But I was a part of the rubric that was created, which is called Interpreting Slavery with Descendant Communities, that was done back in February of 2018. And part of what that rubric suggests is that you have structural parity on your board. Radical, right? People just like, what are you talking about? Like, we put people on the board who we want to put on the board, not like structural parity, not equity. That's not how we work in here. Well, if we really care about doing this work, if we really care about justice and equity and diversity and being accessible to all communities and being inclusive in how we move forward, then structural parity is a sound way to move forward with your governance. So as some of you may know, I'll give you the sort of the brief synopsis. There was structural parity was something that the board at Montpelier Foundation was listening to and decided to do. And everybody was really happy. And I think at the point that they decided to do that, my best guess is that they did not know exactly what that meant, right? They decided to do it. They signed off on it. There was press about it, and everybody was happy. But as soon as they started meeting about activating what they signed off on is when it sort of fell apart, right? So you have the Montpelier Foundation, which is the governing board of Montpelier, James Madison's Montpelier, but then you had the Montpelier Descendants Committee, which is a committee, a formal nonprofit that came together through the work that James Madison Montpelier did in activating the descendants of the enslaved of that site through different connections with the Black Heritage Society in Orange, Virginia, and other places like that. And so then when they saw this wasn't working, at the top of March, I guess last year, around this time last year, they said that they were not going to do it, that they were not going to do this structural parity. And then everything got really crazy, right? I mean, press here, press there, people going back and forth to the point where the National Trust definitely supported the rubric and having structural parity, but as a co-steward, can't necessarily make people do those types of things. We try to work strategically to convince the Montpelier board that it was the right thing, and eventually through the work of James French and others, they decided to do it. Now this wasn't after firing people on the staff and causing all kind of disarray. But then they eventually hired those people back. They then had they did have parity. They asked for names from the Descendants Committee. The Descendants Committee offered a slate of tremendous names, and they were able to pick a number of them to create the structural parity that they sought. And then after that, James French, who was on the chair of the Montpelier Descendant Committee, was fighting for this inclusion. And then he actually was on the Montpelier Foundation board as well at the time, then became the new chair of the board and now the chair currently today, right? So imagine how much uncomfortability was happening in these conversations, right? But now look at what we achieved though. Look at what we achieved. And that's the important part. That's the important part. And this is a phrase actually I've learned from James French, is that inclusion is additive, not reductive. What do we mean? Well, part of the problem in the communication with the Montpelier Foundation, who were not willing to adhere to the structural parity at the beginning, was that there was sort of this feedback that like, you're replacing us, right? You're replacing one for the other. But the Montpelier board had every right and capacity just to increase the board so that you can have the structural parity, right? It wasn't about asking people to leave to make room for other people, but it was such a linear thought, and it's such a scarcity mindset that we're always socialized to think about this work. Like it just has to be this many people, and now that you want to have structural parity, that means a portion of those people have to go. No, it does not. It does not. If you have an additive mindset about inclusion, then you'll find new strategic and innovative ways to add to in this case, the board, so that you can have your structural parity. And I think this is also applicable to when we're thinking about creating our interpretive schemes and being inclusive with those schemes. This is also applicable when we're thinking about who are we strategically partnering with. Do we partner with the same people all the time? Do we partner with other communities? It's also applicable to when we're trying to create new audiences. Are we always going to the same people, right? I know that we have a strong decorative arts movement in this city and other cities, but we also have great audiences that are really interested in the stories here of not just the people who own this land, the people who labored in this land, both before this land was theirs and the ones that came in after to toil. So there's ways to be additive without being reductive. I've had conversations with some of our sites and the community members who really have a huge concern about that. And so we try to work with them and show them the different innovations that we're creating to make sure that they understand that this additive framework is just adding context to the story. And the context is important as we strive to tell the full American story at our sites. And it's our responsibility to do so. Like, we're not being responsible when we're just telling you a single story, a single narrative. So the danger of a single story, which is a great TEDx by Chimamanda Ngozi, great Nigerian author, she talks about that. And the danger of the single story is it's not true. It's not that it's not true, that single story, but it's not the only story. So if anybody's being reductive, it would be the people who try to promote that single story. So we have to be more nuanced, we have to be more multifaceted, and we have to be interdisciplinary in our interpretation of our sites. And then the other one is Ubuntu, which is an African proverb and concept. It was taught to me by my museum mother, Dr. Janetta Besh-Cole. Some may know her from her work as a director, former director of the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art. She was also the former presidents of Spelman College and Bennett College, and I think at one point she was the chair of the National Council of Negro Women. But I am what I am because of who we all are. If we don't understand anything after this pandemic about interconnectedness, about how we rely on each other, I don't know what it's going to take. I don't know what it's going to take. We have to understand the interconnectedness. The things and the decisions that you make impact me and vice versa, right? And so if we understand that work, things like structural parity, things like inclusion, things like creating new paradigms and frameworks and protocols that are more equitable won't be so disruptive to some people, right? Because we'll understand that we have to be interconnected in our work, which means I have to be considerate of your feelings when I make a decision, and you have to be considerate of mine, right? It's not just because you own something or you have some type of title or lien or whatever the case may be. We all are co-stewards of these heritages, right? These are multiple narratives that we're talking about. And whenever we get into the singular is when we get in trouble, right? Which is the whole problem with sort of the American exceptionalist way of thinking about things. It's a very singular narrative that really breeds, it doesn't breed true critical history. What it breeds is nostalgia, right? And nostalgia is very different from history. And this is one of the harder ones for us to kind of lean into because the work is hard. It's hard work. There's no way for me to kind of tell you there's there's no easy way to do this, right? DEAI work is iterative. It does not end, right? I want that to sink in for a moment. You can come up with the strategic plans, which I implore you to do. You can come up with your inclusion plans that are connected to your strategic plans, which I implore you to do. And I implore you to set goals. But once those goals are achieved or operated on, it doesn't end there. You set new ones, right? Because in 2030, there's going to be a whole other set of identities that are going to be marginalized because of how our society is structured. And so the point is not to become this perfectly inclusive organization in the sense that we're always going to be inclusive of every last story, but the goal is to have the protocols to address those things as they come along, right? No one organization can know all of the things that are happening across the world in terms of intersectional identities, but we can have protocols and mechanisms in place once we're aware of those things and somebody brings to our attention that, hey, You don't have this type of story here. You don't have this type of person here. Now you have the mechanism to actually deal with it, right? Which is super important, and actually is something you can aim for. What you can't aim for is to be this model, inclusive space, right? Everybody always asks me like, oh my, well, in your opinion, you've done this work for a while, you've done this fellowship, you've spoken at places. What is the model? And I disappoint them a little bit with my answer because I said there is no model. There is no model. Well, the work that I do in my agencies to create new protocols, that's a model for that space. You're not going to take that model and just slap it on your organization and be done, right? Even if you could do that with some success, it would be limited success, and you would be robbing yourself of the experience of doing the work, right? So the work that I did and I'm doing in my agencies and the associations I'm affiliated with is important to creating the models and the structures that we're creating. But you have to be able to do that work for yourself. Because if you don't do that, then whatever you take from me or someone else is not going to be sustainable because it wasn't meant for you. The work that we did to create that was for this, right? You have to customize these things, right? Everybody has a different thing. We're all snowflakes in this wonderful landscape of museums, right? And we have to honor that. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not things that you can glean from certain plans and certain initiatives. Certainly, you can do that. But you can't just take my impact framework and slap it on yours and just try to activate it. Like you're cheating when you do that, literally, right? You have to be able to discipline yourself to do the work and create the time to do it. And this is a new one that I really want you all to think about because, I've been part of many conversations where people will say the next phrase I'm about to say, and it means something different depending who's saying it every time. But sometimes people say diversity is everything, which is literally true. But it's meaningless without acknowledging power dynamics. Absolutely meaningless, right? Because I've heard the stories, with different, and this is more of a corporate situation, but people have boards and people are like, oh yeah, we're diverse. It's all white men sitting there, but we have an Italian American, we have an Irish American, we have to lean into the power dynamics of what that means, right? And not to say that there aren't power dynamics among Italian Americans and English Americans and Anglo-Saxons. There's definitely a history for that. But we have to understand what that means. Power dynamics and diversity have to be joined together in the intersection so that we can move forward with this work. When I was doing the work with the American Alliance of Museums Facing Change, I was a senior fellow. What we were called to do was to help a set of museums diversify their boards and create inclusion plans, right? Now, we did this as a cohort of 10 fellows, 2 fellows per 5 geographic areas. I was assigned to Jackson, Mississippi. Right, so everybody's like, ooh, you got Jackson? Ooh. It turned out to be the best one ever because guess what they've been battling with Jackson forever? Racial terror. So a lot of these organizations were already leaned in. They needed work, they needed help and support, but it wasn't like they were strangers to this work. But some of my other fellows who working in some other cities that will go unnamed were battling with this. Like, oh, these very rich, affluent, and privileged board members standing up saying, well, diversity is everything. Well, here's the thing. If you read the letter and the commitment to being part of this Facing Change program, you'll clearly see that we explicitly said this is about racial equity. It's not to be dismissive about other equitable situations, right? But this here, right here, this $4.4 million that we got from Mellon, Walton, and Ford, this right here is for racial equity, right? It's not for all the other diversity that you're mentioning, right? And so what we had to do is really talk about intersectionality, right? Because if your concern is equity around sexuality or equity around religion or equity around gender, those are all intersected with race. You can't ignore, they're not mutually exclusive, people, right? Those things are intersected. And so we had to talk about what that means and how you can use the lens of intersectionality as a tool to address those issues. And once we started opening those things up, it was great. I mean, one of the ones that I worked with was actually what we call a culturally specific museum. It was the International Museum of Muslim Culture, founded by an African American Muslim woman and a Middle Eastern Muslim man. Sounds pretty diverse already, right? But they were very focused on keeping it Muslim, right? So I challenged them a little bit about it. I challenged them a little bit about that. But after we started talking about it, I said, this is fine, right? Because they came from a very activist um, framework in terms of making sure that the Muslim story was told, and they were very dedicated to that. So I said, that's fine, because one of the things I was leaning in on is that right when we had been connected, they had just opened a brand new exhibition on the Abrahamic covenants. And they had a different advisory council that was equinemical, that had, Jewish members, Christian members, and all these different things. And I said, well, maybe this is an opportunity to kind of like lift those people up and put them on their board. But they were very dedicated to their mission and making sure that it was a Muslim first voice. So I said, let me back up. Let's use the lens of intersectionality, and the Muslim world is huge. And it already has the title International Museum of Muslim Cultures. So let's lean into that. And so we went from 6 members to 14 members. And when those original 6, all of them were in Jackson except for one. And then once we got to 14, we had people who were Shiite, who were Sunni. We had people from all different parts of the Muslim world, all parts of geographic areas in the United States. And then we had a much more diverse board there. So these are different things that we can lean into in terms of power dynamics, in terms of intersectionality, that help us do our work. And so I try to have this up here so people can understand the differences, right? You talk through this. You have equality on the left, you have equity in the middle, and then you have justice on the end. And that's why I started at the beginning telling you why I chose J.E.D.I, right? Because for me, that is the aspiration. And as I talk you through this, you'll see that in the equality one, you have 3 people who have a barrier in front of them, and they all have some support to see above the barrier, but you see one person's support is not enough, right? So they didn't give that person the proper accommodations. You go into equity, and then you start to see a little bit different. Okay, well, not everybody needs to get the same support. We need to give some more support to others, and maybe less support to others who may need less, and then no support to people who don't need it at all. But really, the aspiration is to remove the barriers completely, right? That's the goal. That's going to take people being willing to be uncomfortable. That's going to take interconnectedness. That's going to take people realizing that this work is iterative. That's going to take people leaning into power dynamics of diversity. That's what that's going to take. And it's not for the faint of heart. It's just not for the faint of heart. But look at the aspirational goal where you don't have any barriers doing your work, and you're able to feel whole and feel included and feel participatory in what this looks like a simple game. But for me, that is sort of the analogy of the game of life. We all get free access and equal access to that without any barriers in the way, no matter what we come into it, what we have and what we don't have. So we talked about this a little bit already, but this History Museums is a colonial project, and so we have to dismantle this project in order to do our work. This is not something that has not been dismantled, by the way. As someone who is the president of the board for the Association of African American Museums, I can tell you that the history of Black museums is dismantling this project. It has been community driven from the beginning, and it's still community driven now. and you look at other museums for identities and culturally specific groups who are on the margins. It's the same thing with tribal museums. It's the same thing with Latinx museums. You know, these groups, we had to do something different in order to get our stories told. And so there is precedent for this already. What's sort of newish is the predominantly white institutions trying to dismantle this work, right? And that's where you'll see a lot of the work that we discussed earlier around museums of race and mass action and things like that. That work can be done. And not to say that the culturally specific museums are perfect and they got it all figured out. Again, there's intersectionality in this work, so there's still work to be done there as well. But in terms of how they started, they were very community driven, and they had co-curation in mind always. And now you see a lot of predominantly white institutions doing the same work, which is important to note. Then, so in my show, we had the very first episode with the inclusive museum leader. Breaks my heart a little bit to show you this image because the woman on the left is no longer with us. She died tragically to cancer recently. Cinnamon Catlin Legucco, superstar museum leader. When she passed, she was the director of the Illinois State Museum, but she also did a lot of prolific work around decolonizing museums with the Abbey in Maine. And then my good friend and fraternity brother, Dr. Chris Taylor, who has his PhD in organizational development, and they co-edited this book. It's about 26 chapters. I had the privilege of writing one. One of those chapters. It's an incredible book. I think it's on Roman and Littlefield. You should look it up. And what we talked about was what brought them together to even talk, to bring all these great thought leaders around. I mean, they took people from history. They took people from art. They took people from science. They took executive search firm folks who work with our institutions. They really covered a lot of ground in that book. And the book and the chapter they asked me to write about ended up being titled, How Do You Deal with Museums During the Era of COVID-19, sort of doing a play off the seminal year and watershed year, and sort of the racial injustices intersected with the tragedy of the coronavirus. And we really leaned into things like empathy. Like people ask me, well, what do you want in a leader? I want an empathetic leader. I want somebody who could admit that they are wrong sometimes. Like I'm tired of these leaders come up here making excuses when they're getting called out. Like just admit it and try to fix it. Like I don't need to like do a campaign to oust the director. I just want you to take responsibility for the faults that have happened under your leadership and address it responsibly. You know, I think in any other situation, people find that super reasonable. For some reason, museums, we struggle with that. We struggle with that. We have to do better. We have to do better. And we have to work with the communities better in doing the work that we're doing. During the pandemic, one of the things I wrote about in my chapter was we were putting together a virtual Juneteenth festival. Now, mind you, this is when I worked with Parks and Planning in Prince George's County. And in Prince George's County, my Black History program has been doing Juneteenth for at least 16 years. So we're not new to this, right? We're not new to this. This is not post-legislation Juneteenth work. Right? We've been doing this for a while, and it's always been community driven. But we couldn't meet in 2020 for obvious reasons, right? But we did not want to just not do anything. So we did a virtual festival. But we also did not want to miss the opportunity to address what happened with the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, and others. And so I put together a virtual panel. We had our chairman, an African-American woman, say a few words at the beginning. And then I had historians of racial terror lynchings on the panel. I had youth activists who do a lot of activism against gun violence in Prince George's County. I had social scientists, so I had psychologists on there. I had sociologists on there talking about all this work. And I had our African-American park police chief on there, right? Imagine his perspective as a Black man who is a law enforcement person, who is long career in law enforcement, dealing with these issues in 2020 when it was fresh and in everybody's face. We had to lean in. Now, if I had tried to put that panel together a year before, I don't know if it would have happened. I don't know if it would have happened. But we were leaning in the moment, and we dared to fail forward on something that could be considered controversial by some, but very necessary by most of the others. And I'm so proud of that work that we were able to do that together. The second episode we did was I invited these two giants of leaders, Dr. Robert Burt Davis and Dr. Tanya Matthews. Dr. Robert Burt Davis has made his career as a veterinarian and working in zoos and aquariums most of his career. He's held different positions from the Smithsonian to different large zoos in the Midwest. But he's always leaned into diversity, equity, and inclusion in his work. And Tanya Matthews has a PhD in like engineering. and she was the former ED of the Michigan Science Center. Now, both of these incredible leaders had decided to leave the STEM world and bring their talents to the Black Museum world. And now Burt is the director of the America's Black Holocaust Museum in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And Tanya is the president and CEO of the International African American Museum, set to open June 27th in Charleston, South Carolina. And I thought it was intriguing that you have these two multidisciplinary leaders who lean into STEM across disciplines. And we talked about that. We talked about what that meant to them. We talked about how that was useful to see it from both sides or from multiple sides as they worked across many disciplines over the course of their career. And so we had a great conversation about leadership and doing DEI work and how things are so universal. It doesn't really matter the discipline in some cases. In other cases, it depends on the size of your institution and different barriers you may have in your locality. And then we have what I call my special sub-series, We Stand on Their Shoulders, which are our legacy people. So for those who don't know this beautiful woman, her name is Dr. Malta Moreno Vega. And I'm saying it very slowly because I expect you to look her up when we leave here. Dr. Malta Moreno Vega. She is so many things. An institution builder, a Black Puerto Rican woman, I guess I can't remember the exact qualifying word, but she's a Yoruba priestess, raised in Harlem, obviously has roots on the island in Puerto Rico. She was the second director of Museo del Barrio, which is a famous museum in New York City. She started and founded the Caribbean Cultural Center Africa Diaspora Institute in the 70s, which is also located in Harlem. And now she's an emeritus of that. Then, as if she wasn't tired yet, then she goes to Puerto Rico and she starts a gallery called Corredor Afro, which really centers Black Puerto Rican artists and their work. And she also started a creative justice initiative to really talk about policies and different political situations that impact doing social justice centered art and culture. I think she's in her 80s. You would never know. I was just on the phone with her the other day, and she's starting another initiative. I'm like, yeah, this is like incredible. You're doing all this work. And she goes back and forth between New York and Puerto Rico quite often, and she's incredible. So I wanted to talk to her about what it meant to be an institution builder. As you can see, she is not shy with that. She sees a gap, and she stands in it. And that's how I view my work. When I saw gaps in the agencies I was working for, I stood in those gaps. Now, I may have not been an expert in J.E.D.I work or DEI work when I first started, but because I cared and because I believe justice work is an act of love, I stood in that gap. And I tell people about this work all the time, and I describe it as love work. And people kind of look at me funny, but like, man, I don't know how you can do this work if you don't love humanity, if you don't love doing the right thing, if you don't love justice. That's what motivates me. And through that effort, then I gain the skills, then I gain the knowledge, then I gain the abilities to do the work over the course of time. And she's a big motivator for me to have my own institution in the Museum J.E.D.I. And so I riff off a lot of her work, and she just talked in great and beautiful ways about her storied career doing that type of work, building institutions and standing in the gap for the communities that needed it. And then lastly, we have my former colleagues from the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, where a good friend, and she calls herself my mentee, but I think I'm her mentee. The woman in the middle on the top, Sion Waldy-Michael, started what she calls the Center for Restorative History at the National Museum of American History. And say they do a multiplicity of things, which is why we have all these wonderful people on the screen. They do anything from established a relationship with Goucher College, with the Goucher Prison Education Program. So Sion was a professor in that program, and so she taught incarcerated folks about public history and taught them how to create and curate exhibitions. And so she thought, in her infinite wisdom, why not create a fellowship and an internship for those once they are released to come to the Smithsonian and continue to build their skill set at the Smithsonian. I can't think of a better example of reparative justice, by the way. That's the way we do things. It doesn't always have to equal into a check, right? We can use our power and our privilege as institutions and provide opportunities to people who won't get them to then build them up and allow them to continue to contribute to society in a powerful, meaningful way. And so I had the great privilege of being able to meet the first cohort of those interns, and they're just an incredible group of people. They also have an oral history initiative where they're looking at undocumented folks and understanding their narrative a little bit better. They also had a collecting initiative where they collected the iconic marker that marked the place where Emmett Till was murdered. And that in itself will humble you. But what people don't know is that marker has been replaced multiple times. Why, you ask? Because people shot it up and dismantled it and did all kinds of unthinkable things to it. And so they took one of the last markers that was literally shot not once, not twice, 317 times. And this is not like right after he was murdered. We're talking about like a few years ago. Like, so let's disrupt this folklorization that racial terror happened back then. It's happening right now, right? And they took that marker and they put it in the middle of Flag Hall in the National Museum of American History. So if anybody's ever been there, that is prime real estate in that museum. And they had it contextualized, they had the stories there, and they had it in English and they had it in Spanish. And it was beautiful. And so they've done lots of great work in education and in interpretation around these difficult stories that we are seeking to tell in this country. So Dr. Cornel West, who wrote the watershed book, Race Matters, many, many moons ago, before Matters was a hashtag, said this: justice is what love looks like in public. We cannot hide behind our trepidation. We cannot hide behind our uncomfortability. We have to be forthright in this work. We have to be able to have some skin in the game in this work. And for me, this quote is everything. Because again, I operate from a space of love when I'm doing this work. I care deeply about what I do and who I engage with and how I engage with them. I don't always get it right. Believe me, I do not always get it right. You can ask my wife and my kids. I do not always get it right. But I try, and I'm willing to change, and I'm willing to do better. And that quote is everything to me. But in light of it, as we continue to consider museums as sites for social action and places of inclusion and belonging, our first question for museums should be, where is the love? Like, where's the love when you're thinking about these words? Where's the love when you're thinking about these policies that created these inequities and these horribly rigid frameworks? Where's the love that will allow us to see the humanity in one another? We have to be able to see it. That's the goal that I do in my work. Whenever I reach a moment in my career where I feel like I can't do work to advance helping people see the humanity in one another, I'm gone. I'll find something else to do. So let's make this a call to action to center justice and love in the DNA of our museums. Let's do this together. Let's do this as a collective. Let's build coalition around it. Thank you. I think I'm supposed to take questions. Sir. Beautiful question. Thank you for it. I graduated from University of Maryland, College Park, go Terps, with a BA in African American Studies, where I was encouraged and lifted up to create a senior thesis around the Black self concept in the Puerto Rican community, which then kind of allowed me to continue to build my skills as a researcher. I sought to pursue the same master's in African American Studies at Clark Atlanta University in Atlanta, Georgia, and HBCU. Got to all but thesis there, and then I decided to get married, and things happen. Then I moved to New York and worked for a little while. And ultimately, I decided to get a master's in educational administration. And right now, I finished my coursework in my PhD program in American Studies, where I'm looking at, you guessed it, museums and social justice. Sir.
So maybe a little bit of a loaded question, but given the situation in Florida with DeSantis and his attack on education, how do you incorporate addressing the reaction to what you're trying to do?
Well, we in this sector are very concerned because we feel like a lot of his rhetoric and his policies are focusing in on K-12 and higher ed, but eventually they're going to come for the humanities, the public humanities as well, whether that be an historic site, a museum, gallery, or another cultural institution. But in the meantime, what we really want to motivate around is to be there for our higher ed and our K through 12 institutions and be that bridge for them to provide those educational experiences by coming to our institutions. And so we're trying to really be more forthright about that. One of the reasons why I actually entered into this work in the museums was because I came from teaching, was the impact that museums and cultural institutions can have on the curriculum. So to see that being thwarted by him and other politicians is really unsettling for me. And so I've been a part of different calls and coalitions from the higher ed folks who've reached out to us to, there's a sort of a consortium of African American associations like the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. There's an Association for the Study of African Diaspora, the Association of African American Museums, which I'm the president of. We're building coalition to really find ways to strategically push back against what's happening. But it's very unsettling, especially someone who's quite a bachelor's in African American Studies. Sir.
Omar, I like what you said about the pollution is efficient. And I think one of the things historic houses struggle with is that when you talk about including these stories, there's a concern it's going to push other stories out. Because the nature of having a 45-minute tour, you have to do that.
Yeah, our decisions to be made.
Yeah, how do you address that sometimes?
So, and I forgot, Mark had reminded me that I should repeat the question. I didn't before, but I'll do it with this one. So Rob is asking, how do you deal with the fact that when you have an interpretive script or interpretive tour and you're looking at inclusion from an additive context, but yet you do have a finite time to give the tour, how do you make those decisions? And I think there's no one way, but I'll shout out a couple. I think some of those things are really about creating big picture ideas and propositions. As you know, and I think we've all done it, I've done it when I was a frontline interpreter, we can get a little chatty, right? We can we can describe something in 20 minutes that most people can try to probably describe in 30 seconds, right? So I think that there are definitely some interpretive decisions that we have to make in terms of how we share information. There's ways to provide provocative questions and engage in dialogue that will then capture all those things instead of going into a spiel about the wood of the house and the marble of the house and the people who owned it. Like, let's get into bigger questions and make it more engaging. And I think if you do that, then you'll have natural and organic conduits to then fit all that in, right? And then the other way is to really start considering, and I know people are like, oh, it's cost prohibitive. Not always. Look at some virtual reality and high tech solutions. There's some ways to really go into this thing where you don't have to give your whole spiel. You can give the big picture and the big propositions of your spiel, and then that person can have access to that information that you would usually say on an app or on maybe low technology, a piece of paper, God forbid, and you can just give it to them, right? It doesn't have to be all done in 45 minutes. You could do different things to that. And I think there's ways to be innovative. For me, I'm much more seeking people to initiate a dialogue when I'm in a space. Like, I don't need you necessarily to give me a dissertation when I come through there. I know how to read. I can read what I like to read. You can give me some highlights, and then those highlights will then naturally have me ask maybe deeper dive questions. And then if those deeper dive questions give you an opportunity to get into your spiel, then Godspeed, do it. But I mean, you got to ask the questions and give the agency to the visitor. See, when you go into your spiels, you take away the agency from the visitor, and people don't even realize that because we're so used to being the ivory tower experts, and they're here to learn at my feet type of thing, and that's not relevant to all audiences. It's just not.
I think one of the biggest struggles that I had kind of going on with a 45-minute tour is actually just getting the docents or the guides invested in that big picture. So one of the solutions that we've done is we developed an audiovisual tour so that we knew that the full story was being shared equally and fully and equitably. So I guess my question is, as you've worked with these different museums and different staff, like, how do you get people to kind of change mindsets from solely like, we need to talk about decorative arts to we need to use decorative arts as a way to share these stories because the goal is people. Like,
Yeah.
what works?
So she's asking what works in terms of getting docents and guides or whatever nomenclature you use to describe those professionals who do that work to lean in on talking about people first. Is basically what we're talking about here, right? And I think part of it is this crazy thing called third-party validation, right? Like, you can say it working at your site, and they're like, whatever. But then you bring in me, you're bringing somebody else who talks about this and see how it worked in somebody else's site. All of a sudden, the light goes off. Like, oh yeah, and then you're like chuckling in your mind, like, I said that to you like 20 times for the past 10 years, but like this guy comes in and says it, now you want to listen. So it's a weird phenomenon that I really want to investigate more, but it's useful, and it's been very consistently useful. I think also in doing that, you provide an opportunity for the people to make meaning on their own, right? Because they're not being told that they have to do that. They're not being shamed to do it. I think a lot of this stuff has to be done in a query-based learning. So you're presenting big picture questions that are thought-provoking, that make people challenge their assumptions. And that has to start with the docents, right? That has to start with the docents. And I talked to my daughter, my oldest daughter, who is a political science major, who wants to be the president of the United States. I've told her, that's great. She's a master debater. She's a master public speaker, only 19 years old. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to do better about how you ask questions to make people challenge their assumptions. I know that you can debate people down all you want. I know you can do that. I know you'll win the argument, but that's not really the point. The point is to win people over and convict them, right? Not to make them feel stupid and to make them feel like they don't know any better, just to frustrate them. The point is to convict them to do right and to see another perspective. And that only comes if you really put yourself in a position to ask questions that challenge their assumptions. And sometimes those are questions, sometimes those are activities that can be embedded in the experience of an interpretive tour. And we have to also be forthright about telling our audiences that's what we're doing. Because I know some of the feedback I get from sites is, well, people expecting to come in there. Yeah, you do get an audience that expects that, but they only expect it because they don't know what else we have to offer. Like if you actually promote that and market this experience, it's not a tour anymore, it's an experience. Then people will be more open to it. But we have to fail forward on doing those types of things to make sure that we give people the opportunity to learn that way. Stacey.
Omar, we have a question from our virtual audience. And the question is, apart from financial support, how can citizens support museums in this mission?
Great question. I think that going to museums, I mean, certainly, like you already acknowledged, giving is very helpful. But I think you attending museum programs, you attending tours and giving feedback, you being an advocate and ambassador for our institutions is really important. We do have a lot of people that attend museums, but we have a lot of demographics that don't attend museums. One of the most telling things at the Smithsonian when the National Museum of African American History and Culture was open was that the first year that they opened and they took their surveys, I think somewhere around the number of 2/3 of the people who were there, it wasn't just the first time they've been to that museum, it was the first time they've been to any museum. That's a high bar too. Like I'm just thinking, wow, like that's the first museum you've been to? Like, after that, like I don't know what you're gonna do. But you know, that's a reality that there's a lot of people that did not grow up coming to museums. I mean, I was blessed to be born in DC and raised in Silver Spring, where I had parents who were mindful enough to provide those experiences. I went to Montgomery County Public Schools where they would take us to the zoo every year. I had that. A lot of people did not have that. And so we got to think different about that. Please. I think there's that, right? There's people who have gone who may have had traumatic experiences there, and then don't recommend it to their families. And then there's just people, and then that sort of like dovetails into like just people who've never heard about it, who've driven by it all their lives and would never go in, right? And honestly, the reason why I went with my parents was because my parents in Puerto Rico, whenever we had family in Puerto Rico come, we would go, right? It wasn't because we were just going because we wanted to go. Like we were going because we wanted to show off DC to our family. And so, but without that, I might have never gone either, right? So there was never, it was never part of our cultural way of being and spending time with one another. And so, of course, now with my family, I've completely. They're so sick they're sick to death of museums. They can give the tours themselves to half these places because we take them all the time.
There's a lot of work to be done in operations, working with the collections, in expanding the collections, and also in redesigning spaces, etc. How are museums tapping into the funding that's required for a lot of this? I can think of the Ford Foundation, for example, it has a very enlightened leadership, but I don't know about other resources that exist that museums can tap into.
So the question is, how do you tap into funding that will help support collections and preservation and other things that go into museums? But with the idea of justice-centered work. And I think, like she acknowledged, you have foundations like the Ford Foundation, but you also have the opportunity to manage up and manage out. And that is getting in front of corporate sponsors and showing them and demonstrating the power of this narrative, power of these objects, and power to transform experiences and challenge assumptions and create new convictions in our country. And I think if you have that opportunity, you'll convict some people to give money for that. There's also a lot of great work being done by some of the local humanities. Lindsay Baker, the new executive director for Maryland Humanities, although I guess she's not so new anymore. She's been there for a couple of years. One of the things that they decided to do was to no longer support just interpretive projects and public programs, but they're going to support capacity building, because that's the biggest thing, especially with smaller museums. Like we're always being told, we'll give you $20 million for programs, we'll give you zero money for people to support the work of those programs. And I've seen that in museums where they literally get millions and millions of dollars for a program, but no support for the professional thought leadership that it takes to put those programs together. So now I think people are starting to shift from that as well, to start to have more grant programs that actually support capacity building. And then, I think really just letting the community know what's happening around that work, because some people are very anti-membership, but I believe a lot in membership. I believe that not only does it give people an opportunity to come here in a discounted price, but it gives people an opportunity and the green light to be ambassadors for your work. And then once you have new ambassadors for your work, sky's the limit in terms of funding and resources, because now you're creating more awareness of who you are, and you're not just an old building that people drive by every day. I've never sought funding from the National Endowment of the Arts, any of the agencies I work with, but I know that there's a lot more around social justice work that they're doing now. They've re-established the Joint Commission between IMLS, NEA, and NEH. They have a new executive director who actually was Sion Wolde-Michael, who was the director of the Center for Restorative History. So she's no longer at the Smithsonian, and she started in this new work recently. So I think with those efforts, now you're going to see those groups really lean in on grant programs that focus on justice-centered initiatives. And I'm really excited for it. Yeah. Oh, Stacy?
Where do you see this work going in about 5 years from now?
Where I see it going is I see a lot more coalition building. I think we have to build stronger coalitions among our sites, whether they're affinities, whether they're historic house museums, whether it's an affinity around culturally specific demographic, whether it's about a discipline, whether they're history, art, or science. I think there has to be more coalition building across those affinities, across those disciplines. And I think once we start doing that work more consistently, you're going to see a lot more funding, a lot more audience engagement, because now not only have you created a new transformative, convicting experience for the public, but now it's it's interconnected. It's a multiplicity of experiences. And I can come to DC, I can come to this part of DC and have these experiences and grow more. And one of the things that I also hope to see in 5 years is that people use these institutions as transformational experiences to take education to activism and civic engagement. We have to utilize our institutions in that way so that we can continue to grow and build value for our community, because there's still a lot to fight about. There's still a lot to fight about. We still have a lot of structural inequities in our country, in our world. And I think that we get to use these beautiful sites who tell these powerful stories to convict us and inform the conscience of our community to do this work in a meaningful and sustainable way. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Omar. Those were really, really great words for us to think about. And I took to heart in particular the comments you made about there's not one model. And that's one of the things that we found when we entered a strategic planning process. Well, it's been about 3 years ago now, and really trying to use that as an opportunity to transform this organization. And what we found was that we had to find those actions, those goals that were unique and particular to us, while we could learn from the experiences of others as well. So I really, really appreciated that. Thank you all for joining us this evening. And we want to invite you to come back for our next lecture. We have 5 more coming up. So the next one is on April 11th. when Molly Kerr, founding director of History Revealed, will discuss what personal account books and store ledgers reveal about the enslaved community in and around Alexandria. So continuing to look at some of the opportunities for continuing research as well. So we do have a brochure for the lecture series. I think there should be some at the door. I hope so. Yes. So pick that up. You'll get information about all the programs this year. And I also appreciated your comments about membership as well. So we are a membership organization, and I want to extend an invitation. I know many of you already are members. I hope those of you who are joining us virtually will consider that. In addition to the support that provides this important National Historic Landmark, there also are some really swell benefits that come along with that as well. Discounts on shop purchases and invitations to special events like Tudor Nights, which is coming up Thursday, so two nights away. The upcoming one is going to celebrate works of art by women, and so we want to encourage you to take a look at our website and sign up for that. So the way that will work, after seeing the exhibit at the Historic House, then you'll have an opportunity to come over here for fellowship with other members of Tudor Place and other friends here as well. So hope to see you then. I also just want to give a shout out again to Rob DeHart, our curator, Stacy Queen, our director of education and visitor services, and Haley Wilkinson, our archivist, who have worked hard to put together this lecture series program. And it's something we're mightily proud of as an organization, and hope that all of you will join us for all of the programs that are coming up. So good night, everybody. Have a safe drive home. All of you on the virtual audience, we hope to see you again sometime soon. Omar, thank you. Thanks for getting our lecture series off to a great start. Thanks.